Hey gentlefolk, my name is Malte Krug. Welcome back to another episode of All About Keys. It's springtime in 1986, so let's get straight to the magazine's content to check out what new exciting products got introduced on that year's Musikmesse in Frankfurt. And this time the cover is filled again with units that got tested in this issue. And two of those you get to see in the flesh, so to speak. As usual, there's the content list, but here on the left we have an ad from Roland showing off their collection of MIDI gear with an MKB-200 master keyboard as the center. Roland, among some others, has been at the forefront of establishing the new MIDI interface and thought further. You see rack gear controlled by only one keyboard, this guitar synthesizer or the electronic drum pads, including the first octapad on the left. I don't know what these CRTs are connected to because the Roland S-series samplers haven't been out yet. And of course in this kind of ads we'll never get to see any cables that would make this neat and clean image look cluttered. Followed by the letters to the editor, and some of the questions about MIDI connections are answered with little pictures, showing again that people now could afford MIDI gear, but didn't have a music shop in their vicinity or only shops without expert personnel, so they have to write to the magazine as their only option. I bought my first MIDI-capable synthesizer, a DX7 Mark II, in 1987, and only started wrapping my head around MIDI after I bought the next unit. That might have been a Yamaha RX-5, if I remember correctly. The first product shown in the news section is the MIDI Studio from Linn, a product which got presented on the Winter NAMM show in January, but was never produced in series due to Linn going bust just a few weeks later in February 1986. This thing is basically a Linn 9000 in a rack case containing the same technical specs and a similar buggy software. The news from the Musikmesse in Frankfurt this time cover additional gear that wasn't mentioned in the preliminary news last month. And Sonic showed the Mirage Rack, which I already presented to you in two videos, and the brand new digital piano SDP-1, which I never played. But the rack version of that is here in one of my studio racks. I guess Ensoniq recognized the success of Roland's MKS-20 piano module and wanted a part of the action. And their first synthesizer, based on the same chip as the very successful Mirage sampler, is introduced. Another synth you could only find the rack version of in my studio. Well, the following generation's SQ80 I have in my arsenal, which is just a pimped up but still compatible version of the ESQ1. Yamaha gets a full page dedicated to their new products, and some of these I'll feature in this series at some point. They expanded their range of FM-based electronic pianos with the PF70 and 80. The RX21L I briefly showed you in the episode of last December, and the QX21 MIDI sequencer is basically the same as the older QX7. I wasn't able to find out what the actual differences are, maybe only a larger memory space. Both also share the same TX7-like desktop case. A new 4-track cassette recorder gets introduced, the MT1X. The first of a series of 3, and its successor became my first multi-track recorder ever a few years later. For the CX5M computer, Yamaha now offers a 3.5-inch floppy disk drive, a new tone generator module that can now be used with any MIDI keyboard you connect to it, a mouse, and new software. Some of this you can see in one of my earlier videos. On the way I left out two interesting units, of which only one became a major success and is still used by many today, me included. The MEP4 is the first and less successful. MEP means MIDI effects processor. This machine on a ground level can function as a regular MIDI split box like any other to control MIDI gear from a single keyboard. It has 4 individual MIDI outputs and a processor for each that can alter any MIDI data into whatever else you want it to do MIDI-wise. Altering or doubling MIDI channels, key windows for any connected device, independent program changes, volumes, etc. You gain the usual functions of a MIDI master keyboard for any regular MIDI keyboard, like an old DX7 for example, which has a lackluster MIDI implementation. But it doesn't stop there. Any MIDI data can be altered to anything else. You want to play the bass drum of your drum computer with the sustain pedal of your keyboard? No problem. I used to switch the patch select function on my Ensoniq rack samplers with the edit fader of my DX7 too. Your imagination is the only limit. But for the more advanced functions, you have to deal with tables of MIDI data and hexadecimal numbers again. Not everybody's cup of tea, but very rewarding when you get over that hurdle. Nowadays, the MIDI input filter inside of Cubase can do even more than the MEP4, but this is 1986. I'll show you this one when it gets tested in this magazine. Last but not least, Yamaha had a huge success with the following effects unit, the SPX90 multi-effect. Until this, there was effects gear that concentrated on one effect. The flanger flanged, the pitch shifter shifted, and the reverb put everything in rooms. The SPX90 gave you all of this and more in one single unit. Don't get me wrong, it could only do one of these effects at a time, but that was still a brand new concept in the day, especially for the price. You'll hear it soon. Korg added the DSS-1 sampler/synthesizer and the first version of the SG-1 sampling grand electronic piano to their keyboard roster. The SDD-1200 is a double delay in a rack case. And without the SDD series of delays following this one, we wouldn't have the typical guitar sounds of a flock of seagulls that got adapted and used in perfection by the Edge of U2. Roland didn't mention these last month in their advance notice of new products and waited for the Musikmesse to come out with their first two S-series samplers, the S50 and its smaller sibling, the S10. I'll show both of these soon. On the booth of Sequential, you could find the Prophet 2000 rack version I used for 2 videos already, and the Prophet VS, which wouldn't save the company from going bankrupt soon. The Akai S900 and its smaller brother, the S700, share a similar relationship than their new Roland counterparts. PPG presented a fascinating new machine whose function doesn't sound too different to present-day plug-in simulations of classic synthesizers. The Realizer utilizes DSPs to emulate other synthesizers. The surface would be replicated on the display, and the surrounding knobs and faders on the unit can be used to alter the parameters of the simulation. Here on the photo you can see the emulated surface of a Mini-Moog. You can find a color photo of this unit on vintagesynth.com. No home computer in those days had enough calculating power to do this, and most people didn't own a PC anyway, so a software-only solution wasn't feasible. You can imagine that the Realizer's retail price wouldn't have been low. It was calculated to be at around $60,000 of 1986 dollars if it ever would have gone into series. That's equivalent to 177 grand of nowadays dollars. Together with the already mentioned hard disk unit HDU for digital hard disk recording and the Realizer, PPG's products have been decades ahead of their time. But the latter never went into production, and PPG ceased to exist in 1987. This month's featured artist is Edo Zanki, a keyboarder, singer and producer in the original sense, who was born in former Yugoslavia but grew up in Germany. In the interview he lets us into his career and work philosophy. If you like to hear how a Yamaha GS1 sounds when played properly, listen to Die Tänzerin von Ulla Meinecke, which he produced and played the keyboard part of. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2019. This 3-page feature gives us an overview of the basics of digital sound generation. They go into detail about problems that can occur during the analog to digital conversion, including aliasing, etc. After this month's giveaway, an electric piano from Technics, we get the next chapter in the history of the acoustic piano, going way back to ancient times with the monochord. In the second part of this, they even focus on the wood characteristics of trees and which parts and what kind of wood is used in piano building. More software to type off for the DIY MIDI interface for the Atari XL home computers from a few months back. Followed by part 2 of the tech series about boundary layer microphones. For the first time in the magazine's history, we get a summary of a so-called reader's test. A few months back, the magazine asked their readers to write them about the pros and cons of their equipment, and the majority of the approximately 1,000 people who answered chose to judge the Korg Poly 800. The pros get led by the good bang for the buck relation. The follow-up is a built-in sequencer and the good sound. The con most people mentioned is the single filter architecture. I own the version with the inverted keyboard, as you can see in the panel photo of this channel, but I never used the sequencer. And just in time to top that, we get a short test of the Poly 800 Mark II, which is basically the same as the older one, but with a larger memory for the sequencer and a built-in digital delay. Until that point, MIDI master keyboards mostly consisted of heavy 88-weighted keys behemoths. There's a reason I bought a second Yamaha KX88, so I don't have to lug it back and forth from my home to the rehearsal studio. Finally, some companies reacted to the player's backache and their moaning and released MIDI master keyboards in the size and weight of a regular 5-octave synthesizer comparable to a DX7 or so. The Roland MKB200, the Böhm MIDI key, which you could also buy as a kit, and the Oberheim XK. All in all, the testers seem to like the functionality of the Oberheim best, but I don't have one of those to show you. Instead, I'll use the MKB200 to play this month's featured rack synthesizer. All these master keyboards are able to store programs to control connected gear with one button click, and the MKB200 is no exception. But it has no internal memory space. You need a cartridge to save data. When you bought this new in the day, an M16C cartridge was included, but of course that is mostly not the case on the used market. Lexicon PCM70 is a fantastic sounding effects processor, but hasn't been cheap. In this overview test, the only thing the tester doesn't like are the unbalanced outputs. Inputs in comparison are balanced. The Casio RZ1 drum computer is giving the regular musician, who couldn't afford a Lin 9000 or an EMU SP12, the possibility of incorporating their own samples into a drum groove. Up to 4 samples share a sample memory of 0.8 seconds. The structure is similar to many other drum computers. Patterns can be recorded in real time or step by step and then get chained into songs. This is a drum machine that never crossed my path for a reasonable price. Otherwise I would have shown the RZ1 in a video. This time we only get one page of the sound burst, patch sheets sent in by readers with their own sound creations. MIDI Praxis leads us into this month's workshops, and this time we learn about the various MIDI ports, their functions, MIDI channels, and the setup of simple MIDI systems. In the home recording workshop and its third part about sound effects, we get to know what there is to learn about noise gates. Both the function for eliminating unwanted noise on recordings and of course the then omnipresent gated reverb effect. The piano workshop introduces us to the music of James Newton Howard, and one of his pieces is transcribed for us to rehearse if we like to. On the opposite side of the spectrum, in the classic piano workshop, we find background and an example of a Beethoven sonata. 5 pages of Flea Market close the issue from March 1986, so let's flip back to this month's featured unit, the Kawai K3. This synth is from a rare breed of hybrid synthesizers which got released when memory still has been too expensive to fill the instruments with masses of full samples. Hybrid means that the oscillator's short waveforms are read from a digital ROM memory, but everything else following is done in the analog realm, filters etc. The K3 shares this architecture with the Korg DW8000, which you can hear in this video. And the new Ensoniq ESQ1 I told you about in the Messe news a few minutes ago. But before the Kawai K3, we will look at a second unit from a test in the magazine first, the Roland MKB200 MIDimasterkeyboard, but I'll only tackle it briefly because there's not a lot to actually show. Not because it's not capable, but because it's very easy to use. Like I already mentioned in the magazine report, this MIDimasterkeyboard has a synthesizer-like keyboard, which keeps the size and weight down. I'm personally not a huge fan of Roland's keyboards of the day, but that is just me preferring the feel of Yamaha keys. It's not a bad keyboard at all, just not for me, if I have the choice. On the front panel, from left to right, we can find 2 MIDI volume faders for the upper and lower side of wherever we put the split point. Unfortunately, I only got the fader cap of one of them. The previous owner lost that. Then there's the function button, which needs to be held to use the keys of the keyboard for switching MIDI channels, the MIDI mode of the receiving MIDI units, and aftertouch on-off. Each half is also transposable this way, as well as adjusting the dynamic response of the whole keyboard to your playing style. The key mode buttons are used to determine which of the 2 individual parts are actually played. Dual means the 2 MIDI parts are layered. Split is both parts side by side, of course, and then there's the mode of only playing either part, which is then called whole upper or whole lower. The functions are also indicated with these small graphics below the buttons. Further to the right we get the large area for the program selection of each part. This can be done manually anytime. You just have to select if you'd like to switch the upper or lower part with MIDI program changes. But it's more comfortable when we call up the patch mode. This mode only works if you have a RAM cartridge inserted. The older M16C will do. I only have an M64C from my JX8P I played around with in this video. Like I said earlier, the MKB200 doesn't have any memory capacity inside, so you will need a cartridge for saving patches. Patches are all the aforementioned parameters saved into a memory slot, and you got 64 of those, so it's possible to switch between sound combinations easily and fast, even in the middle of a song. Switching is even possible with pedals connected to the shift jack connectors up or down at the back. While we're here, the rest of the connectors are 3 identical MIDI outputs and 2 connectors each for each part's damper and volume control, as well as 1 extra pedal connector to switch on modulation when you are busy playing with both hands. As you can see here on the left of the keyboard, we have the bender modulation area with one of the earliest versions of Roland's typical bender for the pitch bend and modulation. This bender has never been my favorite thing of a controller type. I might be old-fashioned, but I like regular pitch and modulation wheels better. To have a little more control over modulation, other than only switching it on or off and pushing the bender forwards, these two faders up here are for adjusting the depth amount and a modulation fade-in. The topmost buttons in this section determine if all parts are affected likewise or only the upper one. I forgot to mention that the function of the volume faders can be altered to send any one of 122 MIDI control changes, or one of 16 synths messages for Roland's MK7 rack or the Juno 106, including filter cutoff and resonance or LFO and some envelope parameters. This function change will also be saved within patch memory slots. You can't program your own sysx sequence to transmit, but this way there's no need to dive into parameter number tables and hexadecimal numbers. Nice if you own one of the two mentioned synthesizers, which I don't. But now for the machine we can actually hear and get sounds out of, the Kawai K3. I wanted to play it with the MKB200 to feature both machines at the same time, but the aftertouch is broken on this, which is a problem from older Roland keyboards anyway. A similar problem occurred with my JX8P. So we'll get another keyboard. As you can see, I jumped a few years ahead and I'm using an SY77. And I like the keyboard better anyway, and the aftertouch is working. The K3, in this case the K3m, Kawai's first synthesizer of the successful K series of synths, which later ends with the additive K5000 models. I'll get to all members of the series when they get their tests in the Keyboard magazine. But let's start with the K3. Again, I only own the rack version of the synthesizer, which basically only has one flaw. Well, two, when you also count the one that makes it easy to produce a MIDI feedback loop. Because the K3 likes to send everything out of the MIDI out that it receives. Kawai considers this a feature and calls it the standard mode of MIDI in the K3. I consider this annoying, because you can't switch it off. It's just possible to change the behavior a bit. The Roland P330 I mentioned last month shows the same fault, but there it is a software bug. In MIDI scope mode, you can limit the range of notes the K3m will react to MIDI, creating a key window just in case the keyboard you're using to play it can't do this on the sender side of things. Could come handy. Spillover mode is the same as what everybody else calls MIDI overflow, so if you're using the rack version together with a K3 keyboard, you could combine both of these to a 12-voice polyphonic system playing the same sound. This mode would send every MIDI note played above the simultaneous voice count of 6 to the connected expander. None of these modes help to get a regular behavior from the K3m, where the MIDI out should only be used for dumping a patch sysx data to a computer, or another K3. You basically get a second MIDI through in the standard setting, and that doesn't help. The other flaw is that the K3m didn't inherit the alpha dial for altering parameters from its keyboarded brother. We only get up and down buttons. An alpha dial is faster, but might not have fitted onto the packed front panel, I give it that. A good thing, though, is that instead of the keyboard's tactile switches under a foil, which we know from DX7s could crack and break over time, the rack front panel is littered with real buttons. Everything else is identical to the keyboard, which for whatever reason, by the way, only has a pitch wheel, but none for modulation. The K3 is monotimbral, so it can only produce one sound at a time, but 6 voices of it. I always like to see a MIDI indicator on the front of a rack module. It makes finding and solving faults in the MIDI or audio signal flow much easier. The display of the K3 looks like as if it's got inspired by a bit 01 or a Korg DW8000, and with the latter the K3 also shares the hybrid type of tone generation. Various sampled single-cycle waveforms from a digital oscillators get converted to analog and then sent through the old established subtractive synthesis. There are 50 patch memory slots internally and another 50 possible on a cartridge. That should get us pretty far. I won't go through all the factory patches with you, that would be a bit boring, but instead I would like to present a best-of selection to show some of the synth possibilities. The patch memories can be called up directly by the buttons on the front panel, which also are used for selecting the edit parameters as soon as parameter mode is entered. With button 51, we enter link mode, indicated by this dot here in the display. Sounds can be programmed into a chain of up to 31 tones, like Kawai calls them, which then can be accessed one after the other by hitting the link key again, or by a foot switch connected to the back. Unfortunately, there's no K3 adaptation for my beloved Sound Diver editor software, but here's how its internal structure looks like in MIDiQuest. It actually is similar to any other regular subtractive synthesizer, and so it's easy to understand. Per voice you get 2 oscillators with individual tuning. And for those nicely tuned fat analog sounds, the second one can not only be tuned in steps up and down 2 octaves in relation to the first one, but fine-tuned as well. The volume balance of the oscillators is alterable in real time by the aftertouch while playing. And I'll show you later how this sounds like. This is especially effective when very different waveforms are used, of which we get 33 in ROM to play with. There used to be a printed card coming with the K3 waveforms, which of course I never got because I bought this on the used market. Wave number 32 is special and I will get to that in a minute. Let me just quickly run through the bare waveforms. This sound I programmed, we only hear 1 oscillator, and the filter and the envelopes are not doing anything to it, so these are just the bare waveforms. We are at parameter 1, which is wave selection for oscillator 1. And it's 0, which just means it's off. Switching to waveform 1, it's grand piano 1. Bell. Strings. Electric bass. Oboe. Electric piano 1. Which sounds to me as if they wanted the frequency spectrum of DX7 electric piano. Number 7 is organ. Brass 1. Digital bell. Slap bass, because everybody needed a slap bass. But without filters and envelopes, this doesn't sound any like the targeted sound. 11 is plucked string. Classical guitar. Hammer tine. This might come handy when being layered with one of the electric piano waveforms, and there's going to be another one coming up. 14 is metallic wave. Vox humana. Sharp wave. Digital harmonics. Pipe organ. Wood bass. Resonant strings. Electric piano 2. Jazz organ. Glocken. Oriental bell. Harpsichord. Trumpet. Saxophone. Grand piano 2. And now we get to the regular waveform, square, sawtooth, and sine. 32 is a special waveform I'll get to in a minute, and we have white noise. Because the K3, as we can see in the structure, doesn't have a special noise generator. So it's not possible to have a 2 oscillator sound plus some noise. You always have to sacrifice one of the oscillators to get noise. As usual, with this kind of instruments, the waveforms barely remind us of the actual instrument they are sampled from or modeled and named after. The analog section has to do its magic to get these single-cycle waveforms into playable sounds, and you'll get to hear some soon. Unlike the individual autoband function of the DW8000, this parameter in the K3 affects both oscillators at the same time. Speaking of bending, there's a portamento function as well. For the well-known glide effect while playing, its speed can be edited. After all that, both oscillator signals go through a regular VCF with resonance, which can be modulated by its own envelope. The LFO, aftertouch and key tracking. And like in some Junos, there's a static high-pass filter as well. Then follows a VCA, which can be modulated by the same sources as the filter. The LFO waveform, by the way, can have 7 different shapes, and the built-in chorus has also 7 effects variations. This thing fattens up the sound quite well. Now for the waveform number 32. This is a programmable waveform, and once done, gets treated by the oscillators like any other waveform in ROM. With every patch bank of 50 sounds, it's possible to save one of those programmable waveforms, in this case one internally and one on the RAM card, with its respective patch bank. It also can be saved or edited through MIDI like the rest of the patches. The creation of this waveform is pretty similar to what you can do with the Fourier synthesis of the Versi MK1, which I featured in the last episode, but I didn't dive in deeper into that part of said synthesizer then. So now you get to see how it's done in the K3. The programmable waveform can consist out of a selection of up to 32 harmonics from a range of 128. Of course, these harmonics are all sine waves with individual levels, which are called intensities. Due to all harmonics following the natural overtone series over the fundamental, it's not possible to make inharmonic waveforms. That's why some of the other ROM waveforms contain some inharmonic frequency ranges. Again, it's much easier and faster to use an editor, which in MIDiQuest looks like this, than to program this waveform on the machine directly. Although there are functions on the machine to reduce the amount of button pushing for harmonic selection and level adjustment, using an editor is recommended. Another thing that makes it a bit tedious is that the K3 is not able to give you an immediate result while you're doing the programming, and it doesn't matter if it's done on the machine or an editor is used. In the first case, the K3 has to render the waveform first before you can listen to it, or when using the editor an extra MIDI dump is necessary. The procedure on the machine goes as follows. To be able to hear what you were actually doing once you rendered the waveform, one should start with a patch that is using waveform 32, and we have that already. Then you have to hit the Master button, followed by the HI button, number 46, which is an abbreviation of harmonic and intensity. Then we can just select harmonics, switch with HI to the intensity, and alter that, and back and forth until the count went up to 32 or we ran out of patience. This is the counter, by the way. That should be enough. I have no idea what I did. For rendering and being able to hear what we created, hit right. The flashing LED down here shows us that the waveform is not yet saved internally onto the cartridge. But we can hear it now. Hit right again and we're back in the edit mode. Button 47 and 48 hold two other functions for the wave creation, and erase is for getting rid of intensities. Yeah, I know it's tedious. I won't go through all of the 128. But if we go on right now, we shouldn't hear anything. Oh, there seem to be some very high harmonics left, which I didn't scroll to. Well, whatever. So, the copy function is a shortcut to assign intensities to a series of harmonics. The intensities can all be the same, or increase or decrease at a steady rate. It works like this. Well, okay, hit copy. Let's do -2, for example. Hit copy and hold it. Now you see if I go, when I go through the parameters, the intensity lowers by 2. And we can do that until it's 0, for example. Let's hear it. After you use the copy function, you can edit individual harmonics like before. Just get out of the copy mode and alter harmonics like you used to. Or you start at a different harmonic and use a different step range to go the other direction or a different slope. It's actually not too complicated. The only thing the copy function cannot do is leaving gaps in a series of harmonics. If you like to program a square waveform, which only uses the odd number harmonics, you would need to do that manually. Or use the internal square wave on slot number 29. No matter what, despite my bad examples, this system can come up with some interesting waveforms. In the following years, there were more instruments that used a similar system as part of their sound generating palette. The Korg DSS1 sampler / synthesizer comes to mind, or the aforementioned Versi MK1 and the Casio FZ1 sampler. But now, finally, let's hear some sounds from the Kawai K3. I'm not so much focusing on sounds that try to imitate real instruments. Well, let's start. Typical brass in fifth. Because in the age of the DX7 and due to Tina Turner, everybody needed this sound. Blues harp, which is not very good actually. Number 3, chariots. By the way, the names of these I took from a list, which I think fitted the actual sounds I grabbed from various banks. For some of them, at the end, I don't have the names because the K3 doesn't have a display for names. So even in an editor, it just shows tone from Kawai K3m. But there's no name saved with the sound inside of a K3. There we have the aftertouch influencing the VCF frequency. The K3 is capable of some effect sounds. This is one of them. Clouds. Filter envelope is closing when you lift the keys. Combo organ, sound that is very much used by a band that is just not talking to me. Yeah, not my cup of tea. Delay organ. I have no idea what the delay in this means, but the organ is not too bad, especially if you add some effects. Digibass. Yeah, very 80s. In the list, this was called flute ensemble, but for me it sounds like a cicada. I heard worse sounding, original, natural cicadas. Now French ensemble. Pretty tame brass sound, but there's some more stuff coming up. Melo strings. I like those. Nice pad. Well, in the list this was called pipe flute, but I think it's an electric piano. Yeah, it has weird dynamics, but if you hit it hard, it actually sounds not too bad. I guess one has to alter this. Now the bass. Rain bells. I don't hear a lot of bells. And I don't hear a lot of rain. Repeater. Some LFO action again. Well, LFO on the amp and aftertouch on the filter frequency. Slow rise, which is a sound where portamento is used, as you can see. Aftertouch on the filter. I like that one. String section. Space Vox. I called this loud organ. That's why I turned the volume down. Yeah, that's what I call a broken Leslie. Velocity once in a while is a bit weird with this. That is a nice synthesizer brass. Guess what we can play? I like it. That's one of the sound examples for when the aftertouch is blending the balance from one oscillator to the other one. Another effect sound. And in the decade of the DX7, of course, we need some tubular bells. Which are actually not too bad. Need some chorus. A little bit of dynamic. The Kawai K3 is definitely capable of producing some interesting sounds outside the regular arsenal of subtractive synthesis. Having various digital oscillator waveforms adds a lot of variety, similar to what Korg did in the DW8000, and it foreshadows the upcoming age of samples and synthesis instruments during the 90s following the Korg M1. A lot of the factory sounds I didn't play today because, in my opinion, they're mostly not very good or representative of what this synthesizer could actually do. Even the tester in the magazine remarked that the sounds sometimes react weirdly while being played dynamically, and I can attest to that. With some of the factory tones, the sound programmers try to compete with the new digital sound aesthetics introduced by the DX7 a few years earlier to get a share of the market. But this didn't necessarily complement the K3 and ignored its hybrid strengths. Investing some time into editing the sounds for better playability and, of course, going further and adding your personal touch gets rewarded by the K3. I'm thinking of making a video after the Ensoniq ESQ1 gets its test in the Keyboard Magazin, in which the main 3 units of this generation of hybrid analog-digital synthesis architecture will be compared: the Korg DW8000, the Kawai K3 and the Ensoniq ESQ1. Leave a comment down below and tell me if you would like to see and hear that combo. Please consider to do all the clicking down below. This will help out the channel immensely. You know the drill, and it's for free. Thank you very much for watching and see you again soon on All About Keys.